So, this week, the world's richest came together at the inauguration of Donald Trump, and a little bit later on in the week at Davos, that brings together some of the world's most powerful people each year. Now, to mark the occasion, Oxfam published new research that shows that the world's billionaires are getting much richer and much faster. And that's true for here in the UK too. The UK's billionaires have now been growing their wealth over the last year by an extraordinary £35 million each year. This research comes hot on the heels of a report at the end of last year that shows that 1 in 10 of our teenagers is now skipping meals through lack of money, and the young people in the UK are now the unhappiest in Europe. And that's what I want to talk about today, the economic prospects of Gen Z, this extraordinary storm-born generation that has grown up since the turn of the century. Today, this extraordinary generation faces three really significant problems about pay, about how much they can save, and just how expensive assets are compared to the money that they've got to buy those assets. Let's look at pay first. Every generation in Britain has been paid less than the preceding generation since about 1960. And that reflects some big economic changes and some big global changes that we'll talk about in later videos. But what that means for young people today is that they're simply not paid enough. And it's a particular problem for today's young people because an extraordinary 40% of young people today work in the lowest paid occupations, often in retail or the services sector. They're often on 0 hours contracts, and they lack the kind of employment rates that allow you to basically earn enough to build a good life. So pay is problem number one. The second problem that young people face today is that from those meagre pay packets, they've now got to save a lot more than previous generations. On the one hand, they've got to pay down often quite high levels of student debt, typically well over £50,000. They will then have to save up a lot more for a deposit for a home because housing's so much more expensive. And because they're likely to live much longer than preceding generations, they're going to need to save more into a pension. So that means that building up a pot of wealth is much, much harder for young people today. But here's the third big problem, and this is something that doesn't get enough attention in politics. It's what I call the wealth to wages curve. So back in the days when I was born, back in 1970, born in the holy town of Warrington, the net household wealth of the country was about 3 times the wages that the country earned each year. So the net household wealth reflects the price of assets, like homes, for example. But back in 1970, you basically could earn enough and save enough to buy the assets that you need. Today, that wealth to wages curve looks completely different. Today, the net household wealth of Britain isn't 3 times national wages, it's 10 times national wages. That means that assets are way more expensive compared to what people earn than they were when I was born. What that means in practice is that the assets that people need for a good life, like a home to call your own, are far more inaccessible to young people than they were back in the 1970s. Now, some of you might remember there was an incident where Kirsty Allsop was alleged to say that young people could get on the housing ladder if they just cancelled their gym memberships and stopped drinking coffee at Starbucks and maybe cancelled the Netflix subscription. It was left to the Sunday Times to point out that even if young people did all of that, it would still take them about 39 years to save up enough for the average deposit on a home. Here is the bad news. This situation, this inequality that we confront today, this inequality that is hurting the next generation, is about to get much, much worse. 2 big things are about to happen over the next 10 to 20 years in our country. The first, I'm afraid to say, is that the baby boomers will shuffle off this mortal coil and bequeath £5.5 trillion to the next generation. But here's the challenge. Some people will inherit fortunes, but others will inherit care bills. So Gen Z is about to become the most unequal generation in decades if we don't change some things fast. That will come at exactly the same time that a second problem will hit our economy. Artificial intelligence, automation, will begin to destroy many of those low-paid jobs that young people happen to work in. In fact, Carl Frey at Oxford University estimates that about 47% of jobs in our economy could be vulnerable to automation. What does that mean for Britain? Well, we worked this out a couple of years ago. We estimate that automation could cost more jobs in the British economy than the shutdown of the coal industry and the steel industry put together. What that will basically mean is that there will be much more downward pressure on wages in the future. So this is the dilemma that Gen Z now confronts. On the one hand, wealth inequality is going to grow because inherited wealth will come down the generations unequally, but at the same time, pressure on wages will continue to grow too. So it will become potentially even harder than it is today for Gen Z to build the wealth that they need in order to live a good life with security and freedom. So this is a problem that is not going to fix itself. This is a problem that requires us to think quite radically and quite boldly about new solutions. And we should be optimistic. Kristalina Georgieva is the head of the International Monetary Fund, and a year or two ago she made a really important speech that was a memorial, a testament to John Maynard Keynes' famous essay, The Economic Prospects of Our Grandchildren. Back in the 1920s, Keynes was looking at the way that wealth was growing, and he forecast in a century's time that the world would be so much richer that we could all basically slough off a couple of days a week and make do with far fewer working days than we have today. It didn't turn out like that, because what Keynes forgot to factor in is the growth in inequality. But if we fix inequality, world wealth is going to grow around 13-fold over the next century. So there could be an abundance that could allow us all sorts of new options if we fairly share that wealth in the future. If we don't do this, I think we're going to be in real trouble. Young people today already have much lower confidence in democracy than any preceding generation. In fact, research that was published last year shows that a third of young people today would be perfectly happy with an autocrat in charge who basically was a strong man, did things as he liked to do without any kind of consultation in democracy or parliament. Under half of millennials are confident in democracy today. So there's a real risk here that if people don't have any kind of confidence that democracy is actually going to work for them and fix our economy and fix our country so that they can get on with life, then frankly, we become far more vulnerable to that kind of takeover by autocrats that we've seen in other parts of the world. So that's why I've written this book, to try and provoke a debate about how we rebuild an old ideal, an ideal that was once cherished on both left and right in politics. It's the idea of the wealth-owning democracy. I don't think it's good enough simply for us to build a wealthy democracy. What I think we should be trying to do is to build a democracy of wealth. And in the next few videos, I'm going to set out some of the ideas in the book, The Inequality of Wealth, about how we do just that. Thanks for watching, and if you've liked this video, please share it with your networks, and of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.